Hey guys, so we're going to start with a little review and then we're going to get into some exponent rules. Okay, so on the first one I have 17x minus 25x. Notice both of those numbers have the x behind them, so they're alike. They are like terms. So that means we can combine them, which means add. Well, I see a 17 and a negative 25. So when I take a 17 and I add a negative 25, that's going to give me a negative 8. So I know it's going to give me negative 8, and I can't forget my variable, negative 8x. Okay, on my next one, I have a negative 23y squared, and I have a positive 6y squared. Notice they both have y squared. Those are exactly the same, which means they are like terms. I can combine them. I can add those numbers together. So if I take a negative 23 and I add 6, it's going to give me a negative 17, and I can't forget my y squared. Okay, first two things I see here is a 3y plus 9z. Notice y and z are not the same thing, which means I cannot add these two together. But I have a y here and I have a y here, so I can add those two numbers together. I have a 3y and a positive 4y, so I add 3 plus 4 is 7. So I have 7 y's. You can't forget your y. And then I see a positive 9z and I see a negative 3z. So z, z, since those are the same, I can combine my like terms. 9 plus a negative 3 gives me a positive 6. So I'm going to put plus 6, and I can't forget my z. Okay, so on this one, if I look at these two, I notice these are not exactly the same. This says m squared n, and this is mn squared. You see how they are different? Which means they are not alike. I cannot add them. So what is exactly the same as this m squared n and this m squared n? But be careful. We have 10 m squared n's, and that's a negative 1 m squared n. So when I combine a 10 and a negative 1, that's going to give me 9. So I'm going to have 9 m squared n. And I can't forget about this guy right here. There's nothing else like it, so I'm just going to tag it on. So plus 7mn squared. That's ugly. See if I can write that better. Nope. Tell you what, this one will do. There we go. Okay. So, in the expression x to the m, x is called the base. So your base is what your exponent is touching. Your exponent is that little bitty guy. So this is my base. This is the exponent. So in this expression, I have 4x to the third. We have to figure out what our base is. So remember, your base is what the exponent is touching. So here's my exponent. Okay, mistake is they think it's touching everything right here. Well, 4x is not in parentheses. So if there is no parentheses attached to your exponent, the base is only exactly what the exponent is touching. So this exponent of 3 is only touching this x. So x is my base. And what this 4 is called, that number out front, that's what your coefficient is. So let's figure out what does 4x to the third actually mean. So 4x to the third, so since this is my base, the exponent tells me I want 3 of these bases. So I have a 4 out front, which is my coefficient. X to the third means I want 3 of these guys, so I want x 3 times. So really, 4x to the third means 4 times x times x times x. Okay, the difference between here and here is this time now my exponent is attached to the parentheses. So the base is going to be everything included on the inside. So my base is now 4x. So what that changes is I know I want 3 of my bases, so I want 3 of these guys. So I want 4x times 4x times 4x. Okay, here. Since there's no parentheses, I know my base is only this x, which means this negative is going to be my coefficient, which means I have a negative out front, and I want 4 of these x's. So that means negative x times x times x times x. Okay, here I do have parentheses, so my exponent is attached to everything on the inside of the parentheses, which means this whole thing is my base, which means I want 4 of these guys. So I want negative x times negative x times negative x times negative x. Okay, so let's write out what 4x y to the third actually means. So there are no parentheses, so the exponent that's exactly touching your variable is the exponent that goes to it. So I'm going to have a 4. Notice that there is no exponent on this one, so when there's no exponent, you treat it as a 1. So I know I'm going to want a 4. I know I'm going to want that x to the 1 power, and I'm going to want 3 of these y's. So it's going to be 4 times x times y times y times y. Okay, notice there's no parentheses on this one, so the exponent goes directly to what it's touching. So this one means I want 4. I want 3 of these x's, and I want 2 of these y's. So that's going to look like 4 times x times x times x times y times y. Okay, in this case, I do have parentheses, so I want 3 of everything on the inside of the parentheses. So I'm going to have 4xy times 4xy times 4xy. Okay, so now we're going to simplify. We're going to be kind of working backwards. We were breaking things down, so now we're going to write it simplified. So how can I write x times x times x times x? Well, I know I'm multiplying x together 4 times, so I'd write that x to the 4th power. So on this one, I'm 4 times 4 times 4 times 4. So I'm multiplying 4 together 4 times. So how would I do n squared times n to the third? Well, I know that n squared means n times n. I know n to the third means n times n times n. So really that's n times n times n times n times n. So what I'm doing is I'm multiplying n together 5 times. 3 squared means 3 times 3. And then I have a 3 by itself. That really means 3 times 3 times 3. So I'm multiplying 3 together 3 times. Okay, so we could do this with everything. We can always break things down to simplify it. Like here, I broke it down here, and then I simplified it here. But that wouldn't be very fun to do if our exponent was like, let's say 50. You would have to write it down 50 times. So there's a rule that we can follow. The hard part is remembering what the rule is, but if you can do that, it's going to save you a lot of time. So let's look at what we did. We have n squared times n to the third, and we ended up to n to the 5th. So pay attention to your exponents here. So when we're multiplying a variable, what did we do with these 2 exponents to get to 5? Well, 2 plus 3 is 5. Notice here, we're multiplying 3's together. This one had an exponent of 2. This one does not have an exponent, so it's like saying it has an exponent of 1. Well, 2 plus 1 is 3. So when you're multiplying variables together, the rule is you take your exponents and you add the exponents. So remember, this rule is only for the exponents, only for the little guys. Okay, so I see how I'm multiplying x's here. X's times x's times x's. So my rule is to add my exponents together. So the exponent on this one is a 3. My exponent here, since it's missing, would be a 1. My exponent here is a 5. So I add 3 plus 1 plus 5. That's going to give me 9. So I'm multiplying x's together 9 times. So I'm going to write that as x to the 9th. Okay, this one's a little bit different because I have regular numbers and I also have variables. So we're going to treat the big numbers, the coefficients, the regular numbers like we always have. So I know this is telling me to take 3n squared and multiply it by 4n squared. So I'm going to start with my regular numbers, 3 and 4. It's telling me to multiply. So do it normal. These are not exponents. 3 times 4 is 12. So now we're going to deal with our n's. I'm going to go ahead and write n so I don't forget about it. So I have n squared times n to the fourth. So we just learned that when we're multiplying variables, the rule is to take your exponents, the little guys, and add them. So 2 plus 4 is 6. So I'm going to take 1/2 x y squared and multiply it by 8 x to the third y to the third. So I like to start with my coefficients, my regular numbers, and treat them like normal. So I have 1/2 times 8. 1/2 times 8 is 4. So I'm done with the regular numbers, so now I'm going to move on to x. So I have x, since there is no no exponent here, I'm going to go ahead and put a 1. So I have x to the first, I have x to the third. So when we're multiplying these x's together, the rule is to take these little exponents and add them together. So x to the 1 times x to the third is really x to the fourth. So now we have to do our y, so I go ahead and write y so I don't forget. I have y squared times y to the third. So the rule is to take our exponents and add them. So y squared times y to the third will actually give me y to the fifth. Okay, on this one we're going to have to do it a few times because we're going to have to distribute, which means we'll multiply here, here, and here. So first, we're going to multiply these two groups together. So I'm going to deal with my coefficients, the regular numbers first. So we treat them normal. We're multiplying. 3 times 4 is 12. Then I have to take n squared and multiply it by n to the fourth. So I'm going to go ahead and write down my n. We know the rule is to take these little exponents and add them together. So 2 plus 4 would give me 6. Alright, so now let's make our second loop. So now I need to take 3n squared and multiply it by negative 4n squared. So I start with my coefficients, my regular numbers, and I'm going to just normally multiply. 3 times a negative 4 is a negative 12. So now we need to look at our n's. So I have n squared times n squared. We know the rule is to take these little exponents and add them. 2 plus 2 is 4, so that's going to give me n to the fourth. Alright, last loop. So now we're going to take 3n squared and multiply it by 3. So we start with our coefficients, our regular numbers. 3 times 3 is a positive 9. And now we have to pay attention to our variables, my n. So I look here, I have n squared. But when I look over here, there are no other n's. So since there are no other n's, there's nothing I can add to it. I'm going to leave this guy alone. I know it needs to stay n squared. So n squared. Okay, so we're going to distribute again. First of all, I'm going to take 2a squared b to the third and multiply it by 5ab to the fourth. So the first thing I pay attention to are the coefficients, the big regular numbers, and I'm going to multiply them like normal. So 2 times 5 is 10. And then I'm going to deal with my a. So I'm going to go ahead and write a down so I don't forget. Here I have a squared, and I'm multiplying it by a to the first. So go ahead and put your little 1 there. And we know our rule is to add, so a squared times a to the first, it's going to give us 2 plus 1 is 3, a to the third. Okay, now we have to do with these b's, so I'm going to go ahead and write b before I forget. I'm going to take b to the third and multiply it by b to the fourth. I add my exponents, 3 plus 4 is 7, so that gives me b to the seventh. Alright, my next loop, so I'm going to multiply 2a squared b to the third times 3a squared b. So I'll start with my coefficients, my big regular numbers. 2 times 3 is a positive 6. Now let's look at our a's. I had a squared times a squared. We add the exponents. 2 plus 2 is 4. So it's going to give me a to the fourth. And then let's do our b's. So I have b to the third times b to the, remember if there's nothing there, it's a 1. So 3 and 1 gives me a 4, so that's going to give me b to the 4th. So far today we learned if it's a big regular coefficient number, treat it like normal, just multiply it. But what's new today is if we're multiplying variables, we take the exponents, the little guys, and we add them. Okay, so here I take my my coefficients. 3 times 4 is 12. Now I have to look at my x's, so I go ahead and write x down. I know that this is x to the first, and I know that this is x to the third. My rule is to take the exponents and add. So x to the first times x to the third is x to the fourth. Okay, on this next one, that tells me to take 4x squared y and multiply it by 2xy to the third. So I start with my coefficients. 4 times 2, treat them like normal. 4 times 2 is 8. Then we're going to do our x's. Notice here I have x squared times x to the first. So we add 2 plus 1. That's going to give me x to the third. Now I'm going to do my y, so I write down y. Here I have y to the first, and I have y to the third. 1 plus 3, that's going to give me y to the fourth. Okay, so now it's telling me to take these three groups and multiply it together, so now we're just adding one more thing in there. No big deal. Okay, so we start with our coefficients, and we're going to multiply them like normal. So I'm going to take 3, multiply it by -2, multiply that by 5. Well, 3 times -2 times 5 is going to give me a -30. Now let's do our x's. So here I see x to the first. Here I see x to the second, and here I see x to the first. So our rule is to add those exponents. So x1, so 1 plus 2 plus 1. 1 plus 2 plus 1 is 4, so that's going to give me x to the fourth. So now I'm going to do my y's. Here I have y to the fourth. There are no y's here. Here I have y to the third. So I take my exponents and I add. 4 plus 3 is 7, so that's y to the seventh. All right, we're going to distribute. I'm going to take this 3x and multiply it by 2x. So start with our coefficients. 3 times 2 is 6. Now we have to do our x's, so let's go ahead and write our x. Notice this is x to the first. This is x to the first. Our rule is to add. So x to the first times x to the first is going to be x to the second. Make our second loop, so now I'm going to take 3x and multiply it by a -8. So I start with my coefficients by big numbers. 3 times a -8 is a -24. And then I'm going to deal with my x's, so I go ahead and write it down. Notice I have x to the first here. There are no x's here, so there's no reason to change this guy. This is my only one, so I'm going to write down my single x. Or if you wanted to, you could put that first power right here. X to the first and x are exactly the same. All right, so we're going to distribute again, but this time with an extra loop. So first I'm going to take 2x and multiply it by -4x to the third. So we start with our coefficient. 2 times a -4 is a -8. And then we're going to look at our x's. This is x to the first. This is x to the third, so I add the little exponents. 1 plus 3, so that's going to give me x to the fourth. All right, so now I'm going to take 2x and I'm going to multiply it by -5x squared. Multiply your coefficients, so 2 times a -5 is a -10. Then we're going to look at our x's. I have x to the first times x to the second, so I add the exponents. 1 plus 2 is going to give me x to the third. Last loop. 2x times 6x to the fifth. So coefficients. 2 times a +6 is going to give me a +12. X to the first times x to the fifth. We add the exponents. 1 plus 5, that's going to give me x to the sixth. Last one. Let's multiply. 2x squared times x squared. Notice this is 2. My other coefficient here would be a 1. Oops. So if I multiply 2 times 1, that's going to give me a 2. And then we look at our x's. X squared times x squared. We take the little exponents and we add them. 2 plus 2 is 4, so that's going to give me x to the 4th. Coefficients, I'm going to take 2 and multiply it by a -3. That gives me a -6. Then we look at our x's. So I'm going to write x. I have x squared, and I'm multiplying by x to the 1st. So I add 2 plus 1 is going to give me x to the 3rd. But I also see y is going on, so I'm going to go ahead and write y. Notice there is no y here, but there is a y to the 1st here, so I know I'm not going to change it. I'm going to leave this guy alone, so I want my single y. If there's no other y, there's no number to add here. All right, last loop. I'm going to take 2x squared and multiply it by -y squared. So I start with my coefficients. I'm going to take 2 and multiply it by a -1. That's a -1 right there. 2 times a -1 is a -2. Then we look at my x's. The only x's I see are these guys right here, so there's no need to change them. So I'm going to write down x squared. In between these two groups, the only y's I see are right here, so y squared, there's no need to change it, so I'm going to write down y squared. And that's it. Bye, guys.